David Greenberg is an associate professor of history and journalism and media studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. He's the author of several books, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, a biography of Calvin Coolidge, and a book called Presidential Doodles. His work has won numerous awards. He's also published in newspapers, many newspapers and magazines. He holds a BA in history from Yale University and a PhD in history from Columbia University. And I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for coming. I never get tired of talking about Nixon. I find him endlessly fascinating. Nixon's just one of those, certain presidents as time goes on kind of fade into memory and, people don't have too much to say about them. But Nixon's always controversial. I mean, I have one in here. Are we on? Is the mic on? Okay. Okay, it may be my, no, this one's on. Nixon, there we go, is rich in part because as a person, as a public figure, he was so opaque. And this is kind of a theme of this book I've written, Nixon's Shadow. He was protean. He was always kind of posing as different people for different audiences. Who was the real Nixon? And if you go through all the literature, everything that's written on Richard Nixon over the years, you see titles like In Search of Nixon, The Real Nixon, The Man Behind the Mask. And these Nixon masks, have been this kind of great costume that continue to sell. I mean, nobody has a Lyndon Johnson mask anymore, but you still find Nixon masks. Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1952, 1956, really hated Nixon, said of Nixon, "This is a man of many masks, and who can say that they have seen his real face?" And this is, I think, a trope that you see with Nixon throughout his career. The historian William Appleman Williams called the search for the real Nixon a shell game without a P. So you're moving around the shells, but nothing underneath. So partly, what I tried to do in my book, and what I think still compels us about Nixon, is this effort to make sense of who was the real Nixon. And we certainly know a piece of that after Watergate. And that image of Nixon, of Tricky Dick, that was there in the 50s, but sort of people thought he had overcome, and certainly they saw anew with Watergate, is really his most enduring image, his most enduring legacy. I mean, this is the president who said to the American public, "I am not a crook," the only president we've had who was forced to resign. So Nixon always, will stand out and be identified with Watergate and with the criminality that he orchestrated from the White House. That is sort of unique in our history. But politically, as a matter of his policies and what direction he took the country in, it's a bit of a harder question. Some historians today argue that Nixon was actually a liberal, while others insist, no, that he was a conservative, although the right wing of the Republican Party, that wing of Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater and the National Review, never really liked Nixon, never trusted him. They found him as slippery as the left did. So this question of where Nixon's politics lie is, I think, a really interesting question, and one I'm going to try to talk about today. And I want to suggest that Nixon in some ways bequeathed this politics we have today of a polarized system where we have a left versus a right that are kind of engaged in this sort of trench warfare all the time, and that the Republican Party and the conservative movement in particular, for all their differences with Nixon, learned from him a kind of politics of resentment that I think still fuels a lot of that agenda today. Nixon came to power by playing to a certain kind of popular resentment of elites, of liberals, of the establishment, and he was kind of this gritty outsider who was going to sort of be the people's champion. He talked about middle America, the good, solid people. He talked about the silent majority at a time when there were protesters in the streets and riots and a sense the nation was coming apart, he said there was this silent majority of kind of good, hardworking, traditional Americans who he would be the representative of. So I want to talk today about Nixon and that politics of resentment, a kind of cultural populism that he brings into the Republican Party. It becomes very much associated with modern conservatism. But before I do that, I want to at least give you some exposure to and talk about this other case, this other argument, which a lot of people do seem to endorse today, that Nixon should be reconsidered as something of a liberal. A lot of historians have been making this case for the last 10 or 20 years. Tom Wicker, the New York Times journalist who passed away a couple of years ago, wrote a very good book called One of Us, where Nixon is seen as embodying a lot of the same liberal trends that John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson put in place in the 60s, that Nixon sort of continues this. The same argument was made by Joan Hoff in a book called Nixon Reconsidered. There's kind of this man bites dog appeal to that argument, right? This notion that Nixon, who at the time liberals hated, what if upon reconsideration he turned out to be much more liberal than anybody realized? And a lot of Washington pundits kind of embraced this as the new conventional wisdom, and they like to point out that, say during the Clinton years, that Richard Nixon's universal health care bill was actually more liberal than Bill Clinton's was, and this kind of thing. You certainly can see a whole host of liberal laws and regulations that were imposed during the Nixon years of 1969 to 1974. He proposed, he did not pass, a guaranteed minimum income, a really sweeping kind of welfare reform that would have guaranteed every single citizen a government handout. Hardly the kind of thing we associate with, say, Mitt Romney and his talk of the 47%. He had this universal health care plan that I discussed. He declared a war on hunger, held a White House conference to combat hunger. I mean, these strike us as very liberal, Great Society, Lyndon Johnson style programs. There was also a regulatory agenda. He brought into being the Environmental Protection Agency, laws about clean water, clean air, worker safety, affirmative action. So there was a whole host of areas where Nixon's policy certainly could be said to be liberal. And finally, in foreign policy, Nixon, of course, was the one who made the overture to China to try to bring about a rapprochement between the two countries. It was Nixon who, following Kennedy and Johnson, but nevertheless made great strides toward détente with the Soviet Union, trying to bring the Cold War into a phase where we could have trade and cultural relations and a more peaceful coexistence with our rival superpower. So there certainly is a case to be made. I've never found it fully satisfying, though, because I think it's an argument that puts a little too much weight on the presidency itself and not about the whole political system or even the whole society and culture that he inhabits. You have to understand, and if you've been doing a course on the 60s, you probably recognize this, that Nixon was the first president since 1848 to come into the White House with both houses of Congress occupied or controlled by the opposition party. So from the beginning, he didn't have that kind of mandate or free hand that a lot of presidents have once they're elected to do what they want and put in place their own agenda. Democrats were used to running things throughout the 60s. They were not about to just cede control to Richard Nixon, whom they deeply distrusted. Public opinion was still, even though there was the beginnings of this backlash that I'll talk about, public opinion was still very much in a very different place from where it would be, say, in the 80s. And it would not have been possible for Nixon to try to impose a George Bush-style conservative agenda. The public wouldn't have tolerated it. And the policy experts who now come out of conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and these places in Washington, D.C. where they devise conservative free market policies, most of these places didn't exist. If you wanted to hire policy experts, they came from, basically liberal institutions. So Nixon winds up having a lot of the staffing of his departments and agencies by people who do have sympathy for a large role for government in people's lives, even though that's not his own personal sympathy. And he sometimes gets very upset with people who are working for him because he feels they're not serving his purposes. Nixon, in the end, I think is very much like all presidents, like the policies they create. It's a product of both the man and the times. And the liberalism that comes out of the Nixon year, I think, is not really a product of the man. It's very much a product of the times. And yet, it doesn't quite make Nixon a conservative necessarily. Because as I said, the right wing, the true ideological, highly principled right wing, did not trust Nixon. They felt that he was too willing to make these compromises with the Democrats, too willing to turn his policies over to them. I think if we have to try to understand sort of who the Nixon was underneath all of this, it's important to think of him as a man who did not have strong attachments. He didn't have close personal friendships. He didn't have strong ideological principles. He didn't have strong ethical attachments either, as we came to see. There was something kind of isolated and changing about him, where he could find his way into different situations. At his best, I think you could say this was a kind of pragmatism that made him very successful in politics. Politics demands pragmatism, and Nixon was very good at that. At his worst, you could say this is an opportunism or even a cynicism that ultimately was unbefitting the President of the United States. So you see both qualities in Nixon, but both are rooted, I think, in this very kind of flexible ideology and flexible persona. So how does this translate into a political agenda? There are a number of ways in which we see sort of Nixon, without these strong ideological principles, sort of coming to power and putting in place what does, I'm going to argue, become this kind of new conservatism. I think it's important to understand that Nixon did come out of a political culture in Southern California in the 1920s and 30s and 40s that was quite conservative and traditional. And at a time when America was modernizing, the Southland, as it was called, this was south of Hollywood, sort of south of LA, really was a bastion of Midwesterners, traditional in their religion, who had sort of come here and looked skeptically not only at Hollywood as kind of this den of vice, but also back at the East, suspicious, as some in the Republican Party still are, of the Eastern establishment, of bankers, of big business. These were people who had a certain libertarian streak. They prized a certain independence from government. And this very much comes to sort of be at the root of Nixon's worldview. And as he grows up and as he goes off to college and law school, he's always gripped by a kind of resentment. Resentment of people who are going to better schools, who are from better families, well-educated, who seem to have all the opportunities. And he resents that he is not afforded these same kinds of opportunities. But he fights for them and he earns them on his own. So one of his first big breaks in politics is when he is a congressman on the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948. This is investigating communists in government. And Alger Hiss, who is a former State Department official, is accused of being a communist spy. And Hiss went to all the right schools. He went to Harvard. He was a clerk to, I believe, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He served in the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. So Hiss is sort of a paragon of establishment reputation. And it turns out that Nixon takes him on. Nixon turns out to be correct, that Hiss was a spy, and he's sort of exposed as having lied to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and having denied certain things that were determined by the court to be true, so he ends up serving time for perjury, and Nixon feels vindicated. So the Hiss case is kind of a classic example of Nixon feeling like he's triumphed over one of these Eastern elites. And it's rooted in a personal kind of resentment, but it also becomes a politics. In the 50s, it's anti-communism. It takes a form of a kind of McCarthyistic anti-communist agenda, but as president, it takes many different forms. Coming out of the 1960s, there starts to be a backlash against the liberal legislation, against the student agitation, against the whole sexual revolution, protesters, all the cultural and social changes that the nation is going through quite rapidly. We see changes in sexual norms, we see changes in civil rights laws, in our norms of what is proper in terms of inclusion and exclusion. Religion, prayer in school goes out the window by order of the Supreme Court. Lifestyle changes, all of this is kind of roiling the country. And you know, as I said, many people, of course, are excited by these changes, welcome these changes, or at least much of it, but a lot of people feel threatened by it, that they see traditional values going out the window, whether it's how kids are dressing and wearing their hair, to much more profound issues about race and sex and religion. And Nixon sees himself as a defender of traditional values. Square was the term, right? You know, hip and square. So Nixon was proudly square and would joke about how square he was, and he thought this gave him a certain kind of appeal. And with certain key groups of Americans, it really did. And part of Nixon's plan is that he wants to take the Republican Party, which has been, ever since Franklin Roosevelt, the minority party, and make it the majority party. Samuel Lubell, who was a political analyst, said, you know, there's always one party is the sun and one party is the moon. And the Democrats had traditionally been, at least since FDR, the sun, and the Republicans the moon. And Nixon wanted to reverse this. And the groups that he tries to bring into the Republican Party with this cultural populism, with this politics of backlash, are Southerners, or white Southerners in particular, who don't like the way the government and Kennedy and Johnson have handled the civil rights movement, and don't like the changing nature. You know, they feel their old traditions and ways of life are being threatened. The phrase that was used in the late 60s was ethnics. These were sort of non-WASP, often Catholic, Italians, Irish, Poles, who often from a working class background, who also were you know, unhappy with the way things were going in urban situations, suburban life. So issues like crime, where they felt the Democrats were letting them down. They had been, traditionally had been Democrats. Issues like welfare, school busing. So these issues, Nixon thinks that the ethnics, the white ethnics, can also become part of his new Republican coalition. And then the third group is a much tinier group, but has a lot of the intellectual firepower. We call them today the Neoconservatives. These were intellectuals, many of them Jewish, many of them Catholic, who had been, in their younger days, very left-wing, some of them in various socialist or communist or Trotskyist movements as students, but who also react to the turmoil of the 60s with a sense that things have gone too far. And they, too, kind of move into Nixon's camp. So by 1972, when Nixon is running for re-election, he wins in this massive landslide. You know, wins every state except Massachusetts. And he succeeds in doing this by portraying George McGovern as, you know, ultra left-wing. One of the phrases was abortion, amnesty, and acid. So abortion was only made constitutional, deemed to be a constitutional right in 1973. So in 1972, it's still very much up for debate. What will be the laws governing abortion, both nationally and state by state? Amnesty was a reference to draft resistors and whether they should be allowed to come home from Canada or wherever they'd fled to and be free from prosecution. And acid to kind of the growing drug scare. I mean, not that acid really was at the heart of the drug scare, but this was the alliteration that they used. And so there were a whole series of issues that Nixon used as part of this cultural conservative populism to make his case. Those three, that's kind of a nice slogan, but I want to go through sort of four issues in particular. The first was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, was of course a foreign policy issue, but it really played out as a domestic issue. It was more divisive as a domestic issue than it was as a foreign policy issue. I mean, there were debates of what is America's proper role in the world. Should we be sending boys overseas? Is it our place to stop communism from, taking over Vietnam? But the real debates were about what this meant for America at home. And there was a sense that the anti-war movement, and a lot of Democrats were leading figures in the anti-war movement by 1968, 1969, was undermining and was kind of going against traditional American patriotism. Patriotism, in a traditional reading, meant you stood by the president, you stood by the country, almost right or wrong. Now, of course, the anti-war protesters saw themselves as patriotic too. Abby Hoffman, would wear these American flag shirts. There was certainly no lack of patriotism among at least most factions of the left. But to a lot of people had a hard time seeing that. There was frustration with the protesters, the acts of violence that were committed, at the liberals who seemed to be indulging them. And so this was sort of the beginnings of a kind of patriotism politics that I think still very much is at the heart of the conservative ideology that animates the Republican Party. We saw it a lot in the Bush years, during the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. Was there going to be, tolerance for dissenters? What was our attitude for people who protested, for people who didn't think going to war was the proper course? And the rise of Fox News in particular gave a vehicle for angry denunciations in this patriotic vein. Second was the politics of race. It didn't take long after the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964, it didn't take long for people to recognize that legal equality for African Americans was here to stay. But it did take a long time for the rest of the country to assimilate that into all other aspects of their social and everyday life. So after 1964, 1965, the questions of the civil rights movement shift from ones that are fairly straightforward questions of legal and political equality to much more complicated ones about economic equality. How far should the government go to make sure, as Lyndon Johnson put it, that every American was entitled to not just equality of opportunity, but equality of results, equality as a fact? That was this going to be just rhetoric, or were we going to see it through all the way? Policies about race in the schools, questions about busing and taking people out of their neighborhoods to integrate the school systems. In the North and the South and many different kinds of cities. No easy answers, very controversial. Affirmative action, should preference be given to minorities in college admissions, in job hiring? Again, great controversy, and many people who had been supporters of the civil rights movement parted company over these kinds of issues. Nixon saw these as wedge issues, as they came to be called, as ways of prying loose white voters, bringing them into the Republican fold. He ran in 1968 on a Southern strategy. This was the phrase, where he was specifically going to talk about many of these issues. He was not going to be for segregation, like George Wallace had been. But he was going to use the same kinds of issues in a softer vein to try to build this Southern constituency as part of the Republican Party. He talked about law and order. For some people, this was a straightforward language, that there was growing crime in the cities, and he was somebody who could come in and, with traditional values and attitudes about discipline and punishment, restore law and order. But to others, there was a clear racial signal here as well, that he was not going to put up with the rioting that we saw in many black communities in cities like Detroit and Newark and Watts in LA. So there was definitely a racial dimension to Nixon's cultural populism as well. And then finally, there was a very explicit effort to bring the Catholic vote into the Republican Party as well. And over the years, that has probably been the least successful. It has sort of seesawed back and forth with different presidents. And in recent years, in fact, the Democrats have been able to reclaim Catholic voters in the majority, certainly not all. But if you think about Pat Buchanan, this television figure of recent decades, but he was one of Nixon's speechwriters, came out of a McCarthyite conservative Catholic family, and he sort of fueled a lot of Nixon's efforts to sort of court Catholic voters. So on abortion, we don't associate Nixon particularly with the abortion issue, but he used the rhetoric. He spoke to, and this was at a time, nowadays we associate the leading edge of the pro-life, anti-abortion movement with evangelical Protestants. But in the early 70s, it was mainly Catholic Americans who were leading this fight, who were leading the resistance to legalizing abortion. And then there was also another issue that remains very much alive today. Today it takes the form of the school vouchers, but back then it was federal aid to parochial schools. And this was something going against Supreme Court precedent. The Supreme Court in the 60s and early 70s was very much tearing down, or rather sort of building up a strict wall between church and state. And even under a Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, when prayer in school was deemed unconstitutional, Kennedy said, well, this is perfectly fine. People can go home and pray in their churches and with their families and in other situations. We don't need to have it in the schools. But a lot of people were unhappy with these decisions and the increasing kind of secularization and clear separation of church and state that the Supreme Court was moving toward. So the effort to use federal funds to give to Catholic schools was clearly a way of thumbing his nose at the Supreme Court, of signaling to Catholic voters, many of whom were going to send their kids to Catholic schools anyway, and so they felt it was unfair to be paying taxes that go to public schools that they were not availing themselves of. And Nixon felt he could pitch it to them as a matter of fairness. So these are just a few of the issues that come, and there are many, many more, and you probably can think of many more yourself, crime and welfare, that become part of this Republican argument about cultural populism, that the ordinary people are being neglected by government, by the liberals, by these policies that government bureaucracy is putting in place. They seem to be helping the poor, they seem to be helping blacks, but are they really helping kind of white middle-class voters? And it's a language that even Democrats like Bill Clinton come to use, and even Obama to some extent come to use, that both parties now want to speak to the middle class, that you're the ones who are being shafted, whether it's by one side or by the other. And Nixon is kind of this great maestro of this kind of resentment. Now, when we get to Watergate with Nixon, it seems to kind of override a lot of other things about his legacy and his image. But I think in a way Watergate too is a product of this cultural divisiveness. Yes, there's a sense of personal resentment that fuels it for Nixon, but there was also a consuming sense among Nixon and his aides that the country was off track and it had to be righted. And his willingness to use his authority as president and overstep and abuse his authority as president to reach and attain, to whatever tools he needed to vanquish the opposition, bugging their headquarters or whatnot, was sort of part of the same sense that they were in a cultural war. And if you talk to Nixon's defenders to this day, they talk about it, well, it was a time of war. Well, yes, there was the Vietnam War, but the war they mean is that it was sort of like a domestic war here at home, and that somehow gave the president license to take these extreme steps. Now, not too many people accept that argument today, but I think they do accept some of the underlying premises of this deep cultural division. And again, we saw, I think, a revival of this after 9/11 in the Bush presidency, the way politics became so polarized, even before that a little bit with the Clinton impeachment. You saw similar divergences over race and sexual mores, and a sense that there were two Americas here, and our language of red states and blue states speaks to this. So I think this remains very much kind of in the DNA of today's Republican Party, that to the extent that it has been successful, and even though the Democrats have won the last two presidential races, and people say that the Republican Party is kind of in a bad place right now, we have something close to parity in public opinion. Bush won in 2000, 2004. The House of Representatives remains controlled by Republicans, so it's not as if things have been resolved in this cultural warfare. And I think the strategy of the Republican Party and of conservatism remains very much rooted in the politics of backlash, politics of resentment, and of this kind of cultural populism that I think probably more than any other political figure, Richard Nixon did the most to introduce into our politics today. So let me conclude there. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, things I might elaborate on, your thoughts. For those of you who remember these times, maybe have different recollections, I'd love to hear what you have to say. What's interesting about Nixon is there was nothing in his life that wasn't amenable to public relations. So even the White House wedding, he's happy to use for PR purposes. But the kids were doing it for their own purposes. Julie married David Eisenhower. Right, David Eisenhower, the one for whom Eisenhower named Camp David, the retreat in the Maryland mountains. So they met at college. I think she was at Smith and he was somewhere else in Western Massachusetts or something like this. Yeah. Right. So there's sort of two things here. I mean, the original Houston plan was not regarding the '72 election. The Houston plan was a plan to centralize the FBI and other intelligence activities in the White House. So again, ultimately the FBI director is a White House appointee, but we've had this separation so that if there's either if there's wrongdoing in the White House, or more generally that the FBI has a certain independence from political control. You want law enforcement to make judgments on a professional law enforcement basis. Nixon wanted to bring into the White House a young aide named Tom Charles Houston, drew up this elaborate plan, and the problem was they couldn't get, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was too powerful, and they couldn't get his approval. Now they end up, after all, creating this unit called the Plumbers, which is there to stop leaks, if you get the joke of the name. And the Plumbers are the ones who break into Watergate, they commit other burglaries, and they eventually they get caught, and this leads to the unraveling. Now, in 1972, there was talk, never substantiated, that Nixon, with all his dirty tricks, was going to go further and was going to try to suspend the 1972 election. The idea was they would create some kind of a false emergency, and that this would be a pretext for canceling the election. It turns out there's no documentation to support that they ever had this in mind. I mean, you know, he did plenty of bad things that on their own that are well documented and well established. But it's an interesting story anyway, because I think it speaks to the kind of paranoia of the time, that people were so suspicious of Nixon and so angry at many of the steps that he was taking that seemed to be overstepping his authority as president, that they were quite willing to believe this of him. And at one point there's a left-wing magazine whose name I'm forgetting right now, but they run a memo that they claim comes from Attorney General John Mitchell documenting this. Well, it turns out it's a fraud, and people have determined that it's a fraud, and they have to sort of retreat and retract. But by then it's too late. It starts to get picked up in other sources. This is a time where there are a lot of underground newspapers, on campuses and in sort of bohemian communities, like the Village Voice, but many other smaller ones. So they are all running with this story. So in certain circles, activist left-wing communities, campus communities, it becomes gospel that they are planning to suspend the election. But it actually was not a real plan. And yet it's still interesting as a metaphor, I think, and as a window into the very suspicious politics of the period on both sides. I mean, there was paranoia in the White House and there was paranoia outside the White House. Right, yes, yeah, I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, and certainly the China achievement and, the improved relations with the Soviet Union, go on the very positive side of his ledger. It's interesting, he did maintain this office here in New York for years in his retirement, and I think was behind like an unmarked door. So people often who were on the floor with him in some office building weren't even necessarily aware that he was there with them. But he very much tried, I think ultimately unsuccessfully, but tried in his last couple of decades to rehabilitate his reputation. But Watergate was the spot that would not out. I think there was so much illegality in the White House that it was bound to unravel one way or the other. I mean, if they hadn't gotten caught, the Watergate break-in, where the Watergate burglars got caught, was the second time they were breaking into the Watergate, and there had been numerous break-ins before that, and they would have continued, I think, probably until it did start to come out. I mean, the illegality was on such a scale that you can't separate it from Nixon's presidency. So in a way, I mean, that may feel like a dodge of the question, but I think it's too central to his presidency to put it to one side. John Kenneth Galbraith was asked this question. He said, it's like saying, well, how would you evaluate Switzerland without the Alps? Like, you can't take out the Alps. They're too big. They're too central. I mean, the imperial presidency is a phrase that's been associated with Nixon, and it's actually an interesting phrase because some people use it, with regard to Nixon, who certainly had this view. And in his interviews, when he was trying to rehabilitate himself, he had these interviews with David Frost, and the line that everybody remembers is when Nixon says, well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And so he did hold that view. On the other hand, the imperial presidency also refers, in Arthur Schlesinger's book of that name, to the accrual of power by the president that has been kind of this continuing process since FDR or even since Theodore Roosevelt, and that Nixon, in that sense, was part of a chain. I mean, he went farther and went into illegality in ways that other presidents didn't do, but it was enabled by, especially during the Cold War, this growing popular willingness to let the president do more and to give the president more power, give the president a freer hand in foreign policy. All these things during the Cold War we got used to. Nixon thought, oh, okay, I can do all this. And then people said, well, you can't go that far. So the imperial presidency is something I think Nixon believed in, but it was also an outgrowth of many previous presidents too. So the incident is, as vice president, he goes to Caracas as an emissary of the administration, and there's a lot of anti-American sentiment, and he sort of confronts this angry crowd and sort of shouts them down. And back home, he portrays this as this moment of triumph. I'm standing up to these thugs, these mobs, communists, and so on. And in the Cold War, that played pretty well at home. He also had the incident in Moscow where he has a debate with Khrushchev in an exhibition of an American kitchen, and that also plays well at home. Nixon standing up to Khrushchev, telling him that American technology and consumer goods we're going to win the Cold War, and of course, he was right in the long run on that score. But it also does, give him a very different kind of image, particularly in Latin America, but in other parts of the world, there is this lingering suspicion of him. And although he is, focused as president on Russia and China as kind of his key reference points, in other places, he's still very much concerned with waging the Cold War, particularly in Chile, which sees this coup against the Allende government and the installation of Pinochet. So Nixon is not by any means prepared to abandon the Cold War as a framework for looking at U.S.-Soviet relations, and he sees communism as this threat in Latin America. He's able in his presidency to see communism as not monolithic the way he did in the 50s. So he can see that, well, China and Russia are different, and they can have their own conflicts. They're not just because they're all communists doesn't mean they're all aligned. But he still remains, I think, tied to a very Cold War framework when it comes to Latin America. I think when he was president, it was actually quite a triumph, and many people on the left welcomed it, and many people who thought they would never vote for Nixon. In 1972, this is the year of the China visit. This is the year of visit to Moscow and improvement with relations there. They announce in the fall of '72 that the Vietnam War is pretty much over. And so a lot of people think, well, I guess I can vote for this guy after all, who maybe just 2 years earlier were still very angry. And I think a lot of it has to do with the winding down of the Vietnam War. But then you have some people on the left who are upset. Why does he end the war in '73 on pretty much the exact same terms he could have ended it in 1969, with 30,000 fewer American deaths, without putting the country through another 4 years of turmoil? And on China, there are people who are furious with him because they see him taking credit for a problem that they feel he did a lot to produce in the first place. That is, back when the communists first took power in China, it was the right wing of the Republican Party, and Nixon as a junior congressman saying, who lost China? Saying that the Truman administration, the Democrats were to blame for being, not being supportive enough of the nationalist forces and being too willing to accept communist victories around the world. And that this helped push Truman and later other Democratic presidents into a more kind of vigilant state about communism worldwide because they were afraid of being attacked at home. And Lyndon Johnson said this, that he prosecuted the Vietnam War as much as he did partly because he was worried about what would happen if he withdrew, that would he be painted as soft on communism. So there were some people who felt, well, on its face there might be virtue in the opening to China, but they also resented that Nixon, of all people, was claiming credit for it when he had done a lot to create the conditions that made it so hard to imagine 10, 15 years earlier. The book is called Nixon's Shadow.
Oh, that's the book. Okay.
Right.
What's the second book?
Then I wrote a short book on Calvin Coolidge, a more interesting president than you might imagine. Because Coolidge was Ronald Reagan's favorite president, and there is a lot to be learned about conservatism, about our subject today, from Coolidge, because the supply-side economics of the 80s and a lot of the other ideas that Reagan took up go back to the Coolidge era.
The name of that book is?
It's just Calvin Coolidge. There's a series called the American Presidents series. They have a short biography on every president. It's a terrific series. They're short biographies, 180 pages, something like that, and you can kind of make your way through whichever president you want to learn something about. It's a really nice series. And Coolidge is also an underrated wit. I mean, he was sort of had this dry wit, known as Silent Cal, but it's because he chose his words carefully.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really.
Thank you all.